Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So today I have for you a video that I'm kind of been working on for quite a while. Um, well, I've been trying to get the recordings and stuff and everything together for about a week now. But it is the My Boss rankings. So first and foremost, again, I'm going to try my best to get to the point of things, but I ranked these Stellar Blade bosses. By the way, you're not really going to have much spoilers until the later stage. Well, actually, no, you'll have a couple right away. Again, this is more so if you're trying out the game, the mode of the game, wanting to see how difficult the bosses or just want to know my thoughts. Now, my criteria for and how I rank the bosses is going to be a little bit different than most people probably. Um, I'm going to take a couple of things into consider. I took a couple of things into consideration when doing this ranking. First and foremost, to me, the most important aspect of a boss is the music and the gameplay of the boss themselves. Those are the two most important things. Music, however, will not carry a boss to the top, and bad music won't necessarily drop a boss. Well, too far at least. And as far as what I'm meaning by gameplay, I'm meaning how aggressive they are, their moveset, how flashy they are, and also in the case of certain bosses that are the demo Gorgon, it's I did keep in mind that it is supposed to be a spectacle, and I did keep in mind where these bosses are in the game. That's why, for example, for Bloodborne, Cleric Beast wouldn't necessarily be that high on the list in terms of boss rankings, but for where he's at as a pseudo-tutorial boss for beasts, he is absolutely amazing. Um, but now, discussing some other things besides gameplay and music being the most important things. Some other considerations that I did take into account is one, how much lead up there was to the boss. Um, in the case of my top few, not really. Lead up to a boss or build up to being a specific boss is very minuscule. It really only shifts the rankings if they are ridiculously close together. As far as I can't, that's like basically the last factor. Another factor that I do have, though, is the boss's design. That is a major part of things. The boss's design. That's also going to be why some bosses might be ranked a little bit lower. Um, Now, some of the lowest bosses might struggle. They might excel in one aspect, but they're usually failing at in almost every other way. My top few bosses, it was really difficult to separate the top three. It was difficult to separate the top four until I played New Game Plus, and then the fourth just immediately was like, no, you're definitely not even in the running for the top three. The top three can shift around, but the number one is the most concrete. You will be seeing each battle in the background. You will also be hearing that boss's music in the background. There, except for one. There's only one boss that I did not do this for, and that's unfortunately because there is no good audio recording of that boss's music. It sounds pretty bad in my opinion, and that music is Juggernaut. Instead, you'll be hearing the actual game sound. That's the only boss you will not be hearing the music for, strictly due to the fact that there is no good audio on YouTube that I could find for him necessarily. It sounds super bad, and I don't know if it's just because the music itself is bad, but like I'm gonna try to not hold them against him. Also, you'll be seeing, if I did this correctly, you'll be seeing a different outfit for every single boss. For most bosses, for some of the later, top, more upper ranked bosses, you will see two fights, because I will have a lot to discuss about their respective boss. But for the early game bosses, you'll only be seeing one outfit, but you'll be seeing a new one. Anyways, also, I have Platinum the game. Really amazing. I would heavily suggest you play it. I did beat it on New Game Plus as well. Also, something that I did keep in mind was difficulty. I think some bosses have the Margot the Fell Omen problem. What I mean by that is in Elden Ring, at least in my opinion, Margot, the boss that the game leads you to, the first one that it leads you to, I think he's an amazing boss, but in the wrong spot. I think he should have been later in the game. Godric should have been a little bit. Like, Godric should have been the first boss, but Margit should have been a lot later. Which he is, but I find that later version to be way easier. But, anyways, on that note, I'm going to pass you over to the good old boss rankings. Alright, I put the Corruptor as my number 17. Some background, you will be seeing, a couple outfits. If you have any questions about any of the outfits, just ask me in the comments below and I'll answer in the comments themselves. But Corruptor, I think, is the worst out of the fights. Due to the fact that he doesn't just appear once, he doesn't just appear twice, he appears 3 fucking times. Also, his music is not particularly memorable necessarily. So first we're going to talk about music. Music is kind of just mid-baseline. If we were just strictly on music, he would be a beat. There are bosses that are higher on this list that I think has worse music than this. So, and the music wasn't distractingly bad. In general, Stellar Blade doesn't have distractingly bad music necessarily. There were bosses. But he does appear 3 times, which drops him down a tier. His design is pretty cool, and I like. So he has some pluses there. The 3 versions, once in 807, that's the green version. Second time, as you'll be seeing here, in the desert, wasteland. And then the third, well, that's the second time. The third time is in 809. He's in a little bit of a secret area, and it's actually the only time there's a dual fight, but it's sort of a mini-boss that he's paired with. They don't work well together at all. Also, in my opinion, his attacks aren't easy to read necessarily, because the head is so big that it's sometimes, at least if you're new, it can be a little bit difficult to read his moves a little bit, and also he's super simple. He only really uses a few moves in general, and also he can be staggered pretty easy, and New Game Plus in general, all bosses are going to be a little bit easier because you have your build together. So that's why he's there at number 17. That's why he's in last place. Mid music. Boss designers would also land him at around C tier if I was doing a tier list. But it's mostly because he appears 3 times and he is super bland compared to everybody else. He is the 3rd boss in the game, but that doesn't save him because he's not one of the first 2. Being one of the first 2 is, it saves him a spot. If he was one of the first 2, he'd only be bumped up a little bit. But there's number 17. Now, on to my number 16 boss. Also, I'm sorry if I miscount. Alright, and at number 16, we have Providence. This is the 2nd worst boss in the game, and I know I'm probably pissing a lot of people off already, but hold up. Just hear me out. Just hear little old hot sauce man out on this one. Now, this will probably be might be a hot take, but the music is really bad. Really bad. You'll understand what I'm talking about when we get to probably the top, really is the top 3, but this one is just, what the fuck? Its biggest problem is that it's 2 out of, so Stellar Blade has 3 endings. This boss? You fight him you fight it 2 out of the 3 endings! 2 out of the 3 endings! And the biggest problem is the other final boss is leagues, and I mean leagues above this boss, and honestly is above most bosses in the game. There are, not to spoil anything, but he's quite a bar to clear. And God, now yes, you're supposed to feel an emotional thing when you fight Providence, because Lily's inside of it, but every time I fought Providence, I completely dissociate the fact that it's attached to Lily, as Lily's inside of it. I wish that during the fight she would do some calls or communicate something during the fight every so often. You know, that would make it feel like, you know, less hesitant to just beat the fuck out of it. Now, okay, I just shit on the music. Music's not great in my opinion, especially for a final boss. It is extremely weak sauce. The boss design though is fucking cool. I don't think it really fits where it is though necessarily. I would have loved this as a mid-game boss. I think as a mid-game boss where you get to the area with the Natibas, where the Balile is at, I think having the Providence before a Balile would have been amazing design-wise. Would have fit the area so perfectly. Man, such a missed opportunity. I love the boss design. I think it just doesn't fit where it's at. Now, in terms of its gameplay, I also knocked it down for that. It feels like there's way too often where you're just in the air and you kind of just evade and dodge necessarily. My biggest issue with the gun is the fact that it takes a little bit of time to whip out and put away. It's not like instant or anything like that, which fits for a boss in the higher part, but doesn't necessarily fit for this one in my opinion. Also, his attacks are slightly monotonous before he goes into his quote-unquote second phase, and the issue with this is, with this monotonous sort of nature, the biggest problem is, it's hard to tell which attack. Are you getting the 1-2 or the 1-2-3-4? Sometimes if you're not looking carefully enough, it can be a little bit difficult, if you haven't really fought him that much, to tell which attack is coming. He's a little bit bullshit in terms of scaling as well. This is also another issue with another boss that we'll come up with shortly. This boss, if you are playing on normal mode, don't hesitate to just switch to story mode. Play a little bit more defensively. I'm not a huge fan of having to use revives to beat a boss necessarily. I don't really like that mechanic. I think reviving once is fine, but with the cans you can revive twice. If you want to fight this boss on whatever difficulty you're doing, find the cans. For your health, find the cans. Also, I only have one recording of this boss because I only fought him once. At least when I decided to do this video series, this video here. But also something I do want to mention is 3 bosses in the game have an instant death mechanic. Now, I'm not going to get into very many details into the later on bosses, but I think this boss probably has one of the better versions of the 3. One of the 3, it got knocked down majorly for its insta-death mechanic. However, this one is negligible, and I think it's perfectly fine. If he's too aggressive, though, it is a pretty big issue, because the gun doesn't exactly... More of an issue with the gun that it's kind of hard to move around a lot without, like, quick scoping it majorly. But since there's no real crosshair, until you use the gun, it can be a little bit difficult at times. But those are the reasons why Providence is so low. It's above the Corruptor, though, because it doesn't appear 3 fucking times. Anyways, on that note, on to number 15. Alright, and number 15 is Raven. The third worst boss in the game, in my opinion. Now, I know this is going to be such a hot take. Such a hot, steamy take. Let me explain. I know some of you that have played the game are like, what the fuck is this man's on? Raven is almost solely down here for the sheer disappointment and the music. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. Now, how to explain this? How do I explain this? Let's go. Let's start with the music. The music is terrible for where it's at. For where this boss fight is at, this music is complete shit. Now the music itself, and I'm not saying the music actually itself is bad, I'm more so meaning the placement of this music paired with this boss with its surroundings. The biggest issue with Raven is her placement in the game, due to the fact that she comes right after 2 bosses that are in my top 5. She comes right, well, if we're counting the Demogorgon as well, she's after 3 out of the top 5 bosses. She's right after them. And the issue here is she doesn't have that much spectacle. The music is extremely off-putting compared to the tone of the game at this point. The music gives off, you know, like 2 bad bitches going at it, you know. Like 2, you know, sassy girls going at it, but that's not really the tone that I wanted at this current moment in the game. This boss is so bad that I was so disappointed that I do have a suggested change. But just bear with me for a second. Dear God. Also, the music kind of loops constantly, which I'm not a huge fan of. This was also an issue that I have with Providence, is that the music, musically speaking, doesn't really go anywhere. But also, Providence doesn't have any, like, phases. Raven sort of has 2 pseudo phases. Stellar Blade likes to do this, especially with later bosses. Some bosses have either 2 clear phases or a pseudo extra phase where after they get to a certain point in health, they get extra moves or something like that, sort of taking the Lady Maria approach. There are bosses that do that aspect a lot better, and literally 2 out of the top 3 do this, and they're the top 3 for a reason. Her design, though, I do like. In case you saw my non-spoiler review of Stellar Blade, I hate the dangly bit in the front for the Raven's outfit on Eve. I don't necessarily mind it in Raven's case because it doesn't necessarily get in the way. And surprisingly, despite how much the hair sort of moves and flows, I didn't necessarily really find her to be that much of a problem in terms of, like, visually speaking. That being said, though, she outputs way too much damage. For how aggressive she is, you don't necessarily feel like you have plenty of time to heal without her coming at you. And I actually found her, if you're New Game Plus, you should be fighting her on normal. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts. You should be fighting her on normal. However, if you're playing this for the first time, I honestly, for Raven, I would suggest playing in story mode, but also challenge yourself to not use a revive. In my opinion, the revive system it interrupts her flow pretty drastically, but she outputs so much damage that it's kind of difficult sometimes to not just be forced to use it all of a sudden. And she tanks hard. She is a tank and a half. But yeah, she's down here mostly because of the bosses that are surrounding her. How I would change this, I would have rather have this fight with us playing as Taki in like a flashback to when Taki was transformed into a Natiba. I think that could have been a cool idea. Maybe have her other arm patched up, giving us maybe some version of Eve's moveset. Then I think fighting as Raven there, I think that would have been a little bit better. Somewhere in the middle, before you get to Spire, before you get to Spire 4, but after you fight Taki, somewhere in there, like, throw that in there. Maybe, you can maybe put it somewhere in Spire 4, but not when you get to the Black Natiba. So, those are my thoughts on Raven. The only reason why she's above Providence is Providence's music is just lackluster, and Providence is a final boss. That is the main reason why he's so low. Well, Providence is so low is due to the fact that it is a final boss. Raven is not a final boss. She's a lead up. So, and story-wise, she has so much build-up. And what sucks is it just got completely destroyed so badly. But yeah, those are my notes on Raven. And it's going to be on to the next boss in our ranking. Alrighty, and number 14 is Gigas. Or that's what I'm going to call him. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. Gigas is the first real boss after the first one that you fight in the demo. Um, Now, this is the end. Well, Raven was the end point where I thought bosses were bad. Generally speaking, after this, I think the boss fights are pretty good. That being said, there are certain things that separate the rest of these bosses from the rest, and that's because like nothing to them is necessarily egregious. Now, if for Gigas' second version in the Wasteland area, Gigas would be a lot higher. Gigas has setup for his area. He has a pretty cool design, even though he doesn't really use his head that much necessarily, which is a little bit disappointing. But Gigas is a very solid first, like, real Alpha Natiba fight, which I really did enjoy and I really did like. Now, if you see me destroying bosses, that's because New Game Plus, I was busted, and then I realized I had to fix that in a later playthrough. But in terms of music, this is one of my personal, like, I would say definitely like at the top 5 Stellar Blade tracks. Very solid. The biggest thing that holds him back is that second fight. That second fight is so bad, in my opinion at least. I've had issues to where he'll start spamming the same attack over and over and over and over again. I don't know if that's some issue with his AI that they needed to fix or something like that. It was a little bit better when I went later and fought his second version, but man, when I was first playing it through, he was a major issue that I had with his boss in particular. Also, somebody that really like knows the lore like quite well, let me know, why the fuck is he still there? In that state? I don't really understand it, because he appears in the state that we left him, but in my opinion, it doesn't really make much sense why he's there with the head broken off when we killed him before. It doesn't make much sense to me. I couldn't really figure out a lore explanation for it, so some of y'all that know the lore way better than I, please let me know what the fuck that's all about, because it feels really out of place for him to be there. And he does kind of get you used to the thing of Natibas reappearing, but it really feels like he's the one that should not reappear. If he didn't reappear, though, he would definitely shoot up probably to the top 5. That's his biggest issue, is his AI is a little bit weird sometimes, especially when he spams the fuck out of unblockables. It's really a problem in his second phase, but other than that, I think he's relatively fine. Other than that, however, the rest of the bosses either don't have a really bad version, or in some sort of aspect I find to be a little bit better. So though, that is all for Gigas, and on to, well, first off, before I move on, well, the only reason why he's really below is due to his second version. That's just a short wrap up. Anyways, on that note, on to the next boss. Now, I don't have too much to say about this boss in particular. He first appears in the actual like tutorial. He is a tutorial boss that you do fight again later. It's a nice sort of note of progress that you've made. That's like progressing through the game. You do feel a little bit of progress. It's not really the same as some other tutorial bosses in other Souls-like and Souls games in general, but I do enjoy his design. He really fits his area. He's really up here for music. Again, in my opinion, one of the better tracks of Stellar Blade. He's mostly here because it's nice to see a tutorial boss, because it feels like you don't really kill him necessarily in the tutorial, because you're not required to kill him. It doesn't matter if you kill him or not, but here it matters because he drops loot for you. Drops, damaged weapon core and some pretty good stuff. He's not built up that much, but, I mean, there's nothing egregious. There's nothing terrible about this boss necessarily, in my opinion. There's nothing super fantastic about him either. I think he's the perfect middle of the road, and I know we're not halfway through the list, but the thing is, the top is so, like, very minor things separating them that this boss is kind of a perfect middle ground. Like, this definitely would have been below Gigas if not for that second fight, but in my opinion, this boss is pretty solid. But that's kind of all I have to say about this boss. Now, time to move on to the next boss. Alright, and number 12 might also be a hot take to be a boss. Hell, this might be a little bit of a hot take. The only one that I would accept being a better boss so far than Behemoth is Gigas. Especially if you like his second version, you're definitely going to have Gigas way higher than a lot of the bosses that I have coming up. But Behemoth is... okay, let's start with the positives. The music is pretty good. It's pretty solid in my opinion. I think the later parts of the track fit the sort of desert aesthetic that's going on. I do enjoy the design, however, it's a little bit bland in my opinion, especially in terms of coloration. I feel like they could have done a little bit more to make him have some more pizzazz, because he's just a line with the hand over his head. That's just it. I wish there was a little bit more oomph to his design. That's one reason why he's a little bit low. He is sort of set up in his area, but the biggest reason why he's down this low is due to the fact that he is elsewhere. However, unlike the horse, the hammerhead horse enemy that you fight, the hammerhead horse doesn't have a boss bar. This one does. Also, sometimes his movements can be a little bit hard to read. At times, there's a general, in my opinion, a Stellar Blade kind of has a thing to where you really should not be behind a boss when you fight it. Never. Because it makes it really difficult to tell how well bosses are going to move, and they can move pretty much 360. But some of his moves are a little bit difficult to read, but it's not a massive issue necessarily. But okay. He's also tied to, I forget what her name is, because the pink hair chick from Sister's Junk, I forget what her name is because I don't like her speech pattern in English. In the English dub, I'm not a fan of how she acts, but this is the final thing of her quest, and it's nice for a character's quest to end in a boss, because Enya's quest doesn't actually end in a boss, it just kind of ends. I believe she's the only character quest that extends that actually ends in a boss, which is pretty fun, pretty unique in my opinion. But the only reason why it is higher than the previous boss that I mentioned, the Brute, is one, the music. I do prefer this boss's music over the Brute's music, and the Brute is a tutorial boss, Behemoth is not. So there's also that, and I found his fight to be a little bit more fun, but definitely quite skill spammy. And on that note, it's time to take it up to number 11. And number 11 is Juggernaut. You'll actually be getting in-game sounds for this fight, because the boss's theme is very bad on YouTube. Like, it sounds super crunchy and off, so I don't want to make your ears suffer through that. But his boss fight, this boss theme is a little bit mid. He's up here mostly because of the spectacle. Also, I really wanted to use that hammer. I love the golden mask on his heads and well, the golden masks on his head, but he's really up here for spectacle, especially in his second phase. The whole like pyrotechnics going on is phenomenal, absolutely amazing. Now, in terms of music, I said before, it's pretty mid. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of it. It's like they tried to do something like Hellwalker from Doom 2016, but it doesn't quite work the same, because Hellwalker from Doom 2016, fun fact, is using the bass line of Doom 3. It's using that. So, since it's using that, you know, it has a little bit of riff to work off of. Well, it seems like Juggernaut doesn't really have a particular riff in that low octave and metalness to stand out necessarily. So I wasn't a huge fan of the music for it. It wasn't distractingly bad like Raven's was, but, well, Raven's as far as, you know, misplacement, what I discussed before. But, you know, Juggernaut, I think, is relatively fine. That being said, though, he really is a mid-boss. He's only up here because of, he's only better than Behemoth because of design and the spectacle. And that is it for Behemoth. And now, time for number 10. We're moving fast with it. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Alright, and number 10 we have Stalker. Now, again, keep in mind, all of the bosses after Raven aren't necessarily bad, but they just aren't as good as the other ones. First and foremost, this boss has no real setup. Both times he shows up, at least in my opinion, it doesn't really have, like, there's no lead up. There's a boss that does this stalking element a lot better later on, and he's ranked higher for his setup. But in terms of music, this is a really solid track. Really solid Stellar Blade track in my opinion, so definitely is up this high for music. And it's a little bit strange at number 10 saying this high, but that's kind of how close the rest of these bosses are going to be. Now, something else I'm going to mention here. The boss design is pretty cool, and unlike Gigas, he actually uses that design to his advantage. He seems exceedingly similar to Lizard Man from Spider-Man 2. Exceedingly similar. The only real difference being the Spider-Man 2 boss fight was super cool because you were fighting on walls and shit, which was kind of crazy. But this boss, that's not really the case necessarily. That being said, he does have a second variation. He does pop up a second time. Somebody let me know in the comments below, but I don't remember if he pops up a third time. So due to the fact that I don't remember, I just consider him only popping up a second time. That being said, he's the only boss, by the way, he's the highest boss that appears multiple times. But this boss is so high because his second variation is pretty cool. Also in the background, if you see me doing some weird shenanigans sometimes, it's because I'm trying to bait a specific move, usually. You'll notice this with our number 1 spot. I had to do a sort of a similar thing to get a specific move. But the Stalker, this time, will actually dig underground occasionally. And will resurface, which is super sick, and definitely kind of makes itself unique from its counterpart in just the regular industrial area, because that one doesn't really do it. Also, he has sort of a different spin move, which is kind of cool to see that the first variation doesn't really use. But other than that, you know, really solid boss. He's higher than the previous ones, mostly due to a combination of music and the second variation actually being a little bit different than his first. I prefer the first variation in terms of actual fighting, but having that extra little bit of difference for the second part is really solid choice, and I really appreciate it. And so now that is our number 10 spot. And next might be a little bit of a spicy take. And number 9 is the Demo Gorgon. Now, this might be this is what I mean about a hot take, is I don't know if very many people consider this to be a boss. I do. It's one of those spectacle bosses, and it reminds me, the reason why it's so high up here is there's not really that much setup at all for it, but it's shocked that, oh my god, I just fought an absolutely amazing boss, get yeet out into space and now shoot this, you know, this gigantic thing. It's a spectacle fight. It's absolutely amazing for what it is. It reminds me a lot of Resident Evil, because, you know, usually in Resident Evil games you shoot the eyes. I think this is paying homage to Resident Evil. If I were to guess, I would guess Nemesis, that is paying homage to. There were a few things in the game that really reminded me of Resident Evil. This feels like such a beautiful way to cap it off. Everything is absolutely amazing. It's not higher because it's not like I would have liked to have fought this thing a little bit in more of a unique way, but still absolutely amazing. Spectacle is why it's so high, but it's not as high because, you know, it's a spectacle fight. But yeah, that's it for the Demo Gorgon. And number 8 is Abdon. Now, first off, again, I'm recording this at a different time than the previous set, but Abdon is very good in my opinion. Again, this is all an opinion piece, of course not factual. And I don't really, let's be real here, I don't have a big enough community to really do polls very well for bosses. So I can't, it's kind of unfortunate that I can't do like community rankings or anything like that. And I want to keep things a little bit more condensed to my opinion for now. At least for now. Now, Abdon, yes, I know he does appear twice. This is the first time he appears, and he appears again later on. However, with the Stalker, to me, it's pretty clear which one's better. The first time you encounter him is a lot better than the second time. The second time is more of a unique thing, but like when you encounter a boss for a second time, you need him to be like souped up in a way. I'm trying to think of another boss that does this, that appears twice in a game, but better. Bloodborne 2 bosses don't appear twice. Well, actually, no. Technically, Cleric Beast does pop up again as Lawrence vs. Vicar. It's the same model, very similar moveset. The only issue with that, though, is Lawrence, in my opinion, is the hardest boss. At least he was the hardest boss for me. Orphan was actually not even in the top 3. Orphan, especially now, usually I can just go in at first try without any issues. For the most part, I might die once or twice. The only bosses that really give me a problem now are Lady Maria specifically. Lawrence. Living Failures, honestly. But that's Living Failures if I attempt to do it solo and my damage is not good enough. If I'm not using Ludwig's Holy Blade, I struggle immensely with Living Failures. Because it's hard for me personally to manage that many minions. So, but Abdon in general is a really, really solid fight, especially for, introducing him. He has that sort of spectacle-ish with like the lightning and everything, which the Stalker unfortunately it's lacking in the spectacle department. In terms of music, Abdon's music is honestly, in my opinion, worse than Stalker's. But I think it fits absolutely perfectly for Abdon, and in terms of boss design, I really do like it. His head shape kind of reminds me, if y'all remember, I don't remember the term for it, but back in God of War 3, I could take you all the way back to God of War 3, and specifically after you progress the game for a while, you get those electric weapons that he has. I forget what they're called, but those electric weapons that you get later on, I believe it's the last weapon that you get in God of War 3. Getting those weapons, his head shape reminds me of the electric balls that were housed in those things to use that ability or whatever. But fighting's pretty cool. I like the design for him the first time, but I like his design even more the second time. What really edges him out above Stalker is the drastic difference from his first form is cool, but his second form looks so beefed up, so cool, absolute Giga Chad, looks angry, definitely gives off that demon aesthetic, and he looks very different from his counterpart. The Stalker does look different, but not as different, in my opinion, cool as the other variation. Corruptor has 3 variations. I've already said that 2 of them are the fucking same, and the only other change is color. Now this dude is beefed up, red and black, and the only disappointment about the second time fighting him, in my opinion, is nothing really changed with his moveset necessarily, except he starts off right off the gate with his lightning shenanigans. I wish a little bit more changed with his moveset. I was a little bit disappointed, but all in all, really solid boss. This is I believe this is the last boss that I would define B tier or below. The rest of these bosses would be, if I'm, tier list, they would be in A or S once we get to later on. I only have 3 bosses that are like really in the top, the creme de la creme. So those are my thoughts on the Abdon. He's higher than the Stalker for his second variation. He's lower because again, he appears twice. So the rest of the bosses do not appear again after they first appear. Alright, this is another, well, here's number 7, good old Maelstrom. And first and foremost, I do want to say that this might be, I would argue this might be one of the hotter takes that I have in terms of boss rankings, but for being a gun section and gun only boss, I think this boss is pretty solid. especially there's no other bosses like it. It it maxes out here for two reasons. One, he appears a second time, and as you can see in the background gameplay, the explosive shell absolutely demolishes this boss. No matter really what difficulty you're on, the laser on the gun is absolutely useless, and the explosive shell just does ridiculous amounts of damage to his weak spot. He's an absolute joke in terms of difficulty, but I think he's really cool for appearing a second. Well, for the first time he appears, he's a pretty big shock. There is not really much lead up to him, except you do see a bunch of monsters fused together. He's only up here because he is a gun-only boss, and I think it's very solid for ending a gun section on. I think they did the best they could with him. His music is pretty cool too, and hey, he looks like Leshy from Cult of the Lamb. Don't worry, I'll throw up a picture of Leshy there. So I also really love the boss design as well. That's why he's so high. He's only higher for the Stalker because he's in a gun-only section. He's really solid for being a gun-only boss, and he fits the environment very well, but he's so low because of repeat again, which I forgot that this boss repeated. And there was no changes to his second repeat. But yeah, that's it for good old Maelstrom. Alright, and number 6 is Corrin Cur. Now, I do have a lot to talk about for this boss. Now, I'm gonna get into why it's either lower or higher than other bosses. Now, okay, let's talk about music. His music is very good, especially for the area it's in. The environment is one of my favorites. Just such a beautiful environment to fight this boss in. There is some lead up to this boss as well. She appears in like a little cutscene beforehand, but there is no setup before that. That being said, setup isn't required at all. It's again usually a thing that I use to separate some of the bosses, which I did have to do here. The rest of the boss that is above this, I only separated because the boss has a little bit more, in my opinion, has one of the best setups. However, my top, my number one has no setup to him. I'm sure some of you have figured out probably what my number one boss is, especially if you know what my favorite game was. But Corrin Cur is honestly, the first playthrough, she wasn't necessarily that fun, but upon repeat playthroughs, I really started to appreciate her as a fight a little bit more. Boss design is very cool. Her second phase doesn't look drastically different than her first, but to be honest, none of the bosses really do, except for my number 2. It's kind of rare for the bosses to really have drastic transformations in this game, so that is something of note. Now, Corrin Cur is pretty difficult, but in terms of gameplay, she's up here so high, partially due to gameplay. It's kind of unfortunate that most bosses only have like 2 strings of melee combos. Like they only have 2 forms of like melees, which kind of sucks in my opinion. But she does have a couple of ranged attacks. Now, my tip for those of you fighting the boss is when she does the beam, she actually incentivizes you to jump. Not dodge through the attacks, but to jump. That's something that is very rare for bosses, especially early on, but later on, you know, they kind of incentivize you to jump over some of the attacks, which is really cool, really solid. It's something that Elden Ring doesn't really do, ever. Doesn't really incentivize you to jump over attacks, but also in Elden Ring, your jump height isn't really as high as Stellar Blades is, especially since you can double jump. But I do love the fact that she incentivizes you to jump, and when you figure that out, it's, oh, okay, because first the laser feels like complete BS, because like there's one in particular that lasts for a long time, and it's kind of difficult to tell what direction it goes, but hey, once you learn to jump, the boss fight is a whole lot easier, and it's honestly, in my opinion, a lot more fun to add in that element. Really, really fun boss, in my opinion. So if it was strictly for that, you know, she'd be a little bit higher. Design is a little bit, you know, again, pretty solid. Definitely if it was strictly on design, she wouldn't even be breaching the top 5 in any way, shape, or form. But man, really solid boss. Probably well, it's the second boss in the endgame that I think is super solid. And it's unfortunate because now we're really going to start going into a lot of more endgame bosses, and unfortunately this is why Raven and Providence are so low, is because they come after these amazing bosses that we'll basically be dealing with from now on. The rest of these bosses, there's one mid-game boss left, but the rest are endgame bosses. And it's unfortunate that these bosses are so good because they really bring down Raven and Providence for their placement. And Corruptor is in a perfect place. The area itself sets up for that classic Japanese theme, which, of course, I do like fighting arenas in there. I can't make any parallels with Sekiro. I have attempted to play Sekiro, but I just couldn't really get into it. I'm not a huge fan of how the game works necessarily, but again, certain games like that, it's up to taste. Now, also, something that I just got put out. So the reason why she's higher than any boss before this is because this is the first boss, in my opinion, that doesn't really have anything necessarily lacking. From this point on, there is going to be one boss that does have something that's severely lacking, but it's the only thing holding it back. But in my opinion, this fight has the setting. It doesn't necessarily have the boss design, but it has a lot going for it. It's higher than the rest because there isn't anything particularly egregious in this fight. But it is number 6, and it did not, unfortunately, make it into the top 5. But the top 5, the top 5 are close. But specifically the top 3, there's minor things separating them. But on that note, it is time to move on to number 5. Alright, and number 5 is Balile. We're just going to start right off rip by saying, first off, I have the music for this is sort of like Stalker. It's up there. I don't think it's necessarily a super fantastic boss track necessarily, but as a song, it's pretty good. The song is pretty solid. I enjoyed the music. This boss is up here because, well, like, one, its design is very solid, but also he's the only boss in the game that you fight twice, but the first time you fight him, you don't kill him. This should have been done with some other bosses, in my opinion, but you fight him briefly, you don't kill him, then you see him again, like a little bit after in a tunnel section, and then you see him for the final time at this boss fight, and you have to kill him 3 times because he regenerates or whatever, which I'm not necessarily a huge fan of that mechanic. To me, it feels very off. I'm just not especially since his moveset doesn't really change at all. I believe he gets a little bit more aggressive, but honestly, he's a really solid boss. He's above Corruptor strictly because of setup. Setup is the only reason why he is above Corruptor. However, that being said, his arena isn't necessarily particularly that interesting. It's just another part of the level. Like, it just looks the same as the earlier sections before this in Spire 4. There's nothing super special to it. The arena isn't necessarily something that will boost you out of your mind, but like the top 3 have everything. Have almost everything. There's one aspect of each of the top 3 that is a little bit lackluster, but this boss, it's a really solid high-end boss. It's a really solid high-end boss. If I were to equate this, I don't know, there's really no equivalent that I can properly think of necessarily, but man, super enjoyable fight, solid music, really good boss design. This high because of the setup that he has. He has the most setup out of any boss in my opinion, but again, he's not as high mostly because of the arena, and the music isn't necessarily super like outstanding. On that note, it's time to go to number 4, which might be a hot take. Alright, and number 4 is Unidentified NABA. I'm gonna call this boss the Black NABA from now on. But really solid boss, deserves the top 4 spot. The reason why I think this might be a hot take is people are either going to love or hate this boss. It's definitely is not in the top 3. There is no question in my mind that this boss is for sure not in the top 3. In my opinion, so far, I think how the list kind of can be structured is like the top 3 can sort of be at least number 2 and my number 2 and number 3 spot can be rearranged. For me, number 1 can't. I think, in my opinion, number 4, 5, and 6 can be rearranged, and I think 7 and down is really up to you as a player. For me, though, this music is really solid for this fight. I kinda wish this would have been what we would have had for Raven, because Raven's theme doesn't fit. But again, this is the fight right before Raven, and to me, the Raven fight is so off of pacing because of this fight. This fight is dark and it's pretty damn cinematic. There is a specific reason why I do not believe it should be in the top 4, but first, in the top 3. But let me get into the pros. First and foremost, I love the boss design. It's definitely taking themes from the Valkyrie from Norse mythology. They have the masks and everything. I really do enjoy that. I don't think it's really supposed to be Fallen Angel. I think it's supposed to be closer to Valkyries, in my opinion. However, let's just talk about it, get out of the way. My biggest issue is with its insta-death mechanic. And the fact that the orbs, in my opinion, are a little bit too tanky. Specifically, the one behind the Black NABA is really difficult to actually get at with their spamming attacks that kind of can stun you. It's a problem. In my opinion, it is a massive problem. And it's something a boss that is in the top 3 does have an instant death mechanic that is like this. However, if you're paying attention, it's super easy to get all of them. But for Black NABA, I think I've only ever been able to successfully get all of them down once. And of course for the Platinum, I've beaten her 3 times. And each time it's very difficult to actually get her down. Another issue is she tends to spam the same attacks in a specific order, if that makes sense. And some of her moves are, in my opinion, are a little bit delayed at weird points. I think some moves are just delayed at really weird points. So, outside of that, though, let's talk about some positives. Again, music is really good. I think this track is really in contention for like top 5 at least tracks in Stellar Blade. At least top 5 boss themes, in my opinion. It's one of the reasons why it's up here. Design, again, is super cool. The moves are pretty flashy, have very cool looks. I love the feathers and the lightning and everything, which is pretty phenomenal. And something I do want to mention is, the arena isn't the best. The arena isn't the best. It fits it in a story aesthetic, but again, it's not top 3 because, the combination of the insta-death, weird delays and moves sometimes, and arena, but everything else about this fight is great. This boss is set up in the beginning, very beginning, mentioned extremely sparsely throughout the tutorial level, but she isn't mentioned again until now. But it's great to see this boss actually return and actually fight her. I would have much rather have had the Black NABA here and not instead of Raven's fight. I think I really just don't like Raven's fight where she's at. But again, very solid boss. Definitely did enjoy this. Now, the top 3, it is time for them to pull up. Alright, and at number 3, we have Taki. Taki is my number 3 best boss in Stellar Blade. Now, it's taken us a while to get to this fight. I don't think we really have a hot take here. I think this boss is absolutely fantastic. Again, later on, a little bit later, I'll be getting to my reasonings for why it's number 3 instead of top 2. But, and also I'll give my reasoning why it's above other bosses as well. Taki's fight is amazing. She's up here. Like, she reminds me a lot of Lady Maria from Bloodborne. Just like the cool, just not just from the cool aesthetic, to also the fact that she has basically 3 phases. Well, kind of 4-ish? It's a little bit weird. And she also has her sword stance like Lady Maria does. I think there are 2 bosses that really kind of pay homage to Bloodborne, and I think Taki is one of them. Some of her moves and stances, like specifically how she holds her sword and how she dodges from left to right, I think she really is kind of like Lady Maria. My number 1 is like another boss in Bloodborne, and oh my god, we'll get to that boss. But Taki, the music is pretty solid. In my opinion, it's not in the top 3 or even in the top 5 necessarily, but it's pretty solid. There is a ridiculous amount of build-up for this boss. You're not told outright that it's going to be Taki, but by the time you reach this point, you know it's Taki. You just kind of know. But this boss fight is amazing, and man, just so much to process. Especially, I wasn't at this point in the game, and at this point in the game, there wasn't really any bosses that really had a stage change through their fight. And Taki has, for her like final little stint, she has a stage change, which she's the only boss in the game, I believe, to do so. At least if you don't count the Demo Crawler and the Demo Gorgon as one fight. If you count them as one fight, then I guess that's a stage change, but other than that, there are no bosses with other stage changes, except for number 2, but I don't really count that as a stage change, because I'll get into my number 2 spot later, after this fight, actually. But man, there's so much here. Her moveset is pretty solid. Some of her moves I'm not necessarily a huge fan of necessarily, but specifically damage output. That is a little bit of a problem that I have with some bosses, is their damage output is ridiculous. And I know some people will be like, well, build and this. It's like, well, the issue with builds in this game is if you go into defense, you sacrifice a crap ton of damage, and it makes the fight last a really, really long time. And if you focus on offense, however, your defense is going to suffer. I'm not a huge fan of this form of build crafting in these kinds of games. I prefer mostly how it was at Bloodborne. It was pretty simple. You just had your blood gems, and that was basically it. I also do like Elden Ring's system of talismans. I like it over Dark Souls' ring system, so... especially since Covenants don't do shit. Sorry, Souls fans, but I hate Covenants. You'll learn more about my thoughts on Covenants when we reach Dark Souls 3. But, this boss is really solid. Man, I really did enjoy this boss. The strat that I ended up going for was, like, you really got to use your grenade. She incentivizes you to use your grenades because she can't be stunned. It reminds me a little bit of how Lady Maria, it's a little bit easier when you just use Loveless Holy Blade or Threaded Cane to stunlock her. I know there are some other weapons that do that, but those are the only 2 weapons that I ever used at that point in the game. But man, really solid boss. Again, the only reason why she's not in the top 2 is music. Music is the biggest reason why she's not in the top 2. That and Taki mode is extremely weak. Taki mode is ridiculously weak. Like, holy shit, I hate Taki mode. I went out of my way in my New Game Plus playthrough to never ever use Taki mode. I hate it. It just doesn't deal enough. It needs a damage buff desperately. For being a sort of ultimate move, the amount of time you're invincible, it just doesn't matter when the damage is so low. And you get to higher damage you can get to higher damage values by just being out of Taki mode and attacking regularly with your beta and burst skills. So it's like, it either needs a damage boost or be able to recharge burst energy or beta energy, not both. At least like maybe 1 or 2 charges, I think that'd be perfectly fine. But, well, I guess it can be broken since you can exit it out of it at any time. But, yeah, the biggest gripe is the music. The music, if she would have had fantastic music, she would have been top 2. Not number 1, but she would have surpassed number 2. Something else I do want to note here, she is above the rest of the bosses like Stalker, Katakuri, Abdon, all of those bosses. For one, the lead up. The lead up is so good. The Stalker is the only boss that comes close to the amount of lead up she has. And man, I love the design of the skull on the head. It's just absolutely phenomenal on how they handled this boss. And I do like how in the third phase, well, in the last phase, she takes off the mask, and that sort of removes, you know, the third phase is a little bit more personal, because you kind of, you know, unlike previous bosses where, you know, you don't really feel, specifically more so with Raven, where you'd have no sympathy for her at that point or anything like that. You see Taki's face and everything, and it kind of helps. So the idea is like, you're not just fighting any old NT, but you are fighting the friend that had helped you at the beginning. You are fighting someone that realistically is pretty important. Like, I guess the fight I could really equate this to is Providence. Providence almost has, like, Lily is, like, you don't care about Lily when you're fighting Providence. You just don't. You're not reminded at all that Lily is in that Providence suit. You're not reminded of that at all. She doesn't cry out or anything like that. She doesn't have some voice lines every so often. But Taki, she removes the mask, and you see her face, and you are reminded constantly from that on, because by that time, you might have forgotten that, you know, you're fighting Taki, but now you are really reminded that you are fighting Taki, who is not exactly herself at the moment, but you are fighting her, and you're gonna have to fucking deal with that shit. That is number 3, Taki. The only thing separating her out of, edging her out of the number 2 spot is music. That's the only reason why she was outed out of the number 2 spot. Again, as I said before, number 1 is set in stone. There is zero changing number 1. For reasons. Guys, now it's time to move on to my number 2 boss. Man, the music is so good. For this boss, it is the best. It's in the top 3 best boss themes in this game. Top 3 guaranteed. This boss, I was not expecting for Adam to really fight for the top 3. Now, something that I do have to point out immediately is there is a very interesting detail where he doesn't attack you. Like, barely ever. You are the one attacking him, which fits his motif. And it's not like one of those things where, oh, this boss is just going to be easy street. This boss, I think, suffers the most. Do not, even if you are playing on story mode, do not fight this boss on story mode. You need to fight this on normal or hard. I made the mistake of fighting this boss on story mode or whatever. I was expecting this to be as bad as Providence was, and I didn't really feel like spending that much time on it. But man, I regretted my decision. This boss should not have been. This boss needed to be the final boss. It sucks because there's so much emotion there. You're fighting Adam, who was there at the beginning, and unfortunately, he lags behind on setup. But as I've said before, the top 2 bosses barely have any setup to them. But man, Adam and his transformation is just so good. You feel like he really doesn't exactly want to fight through his movements, about how much better he is in terms of like his speed, his power. And man, I was so conflicted when I was fighting him, because I was like, man, I don't really actually want to fight him, but I have to. And you're constantly reminded that it's him, like, even when he transforms. And oh my god, the spectacle of when he transforms into the Elder. Oh my god, it's just... holy shit. I was absolutely blown away. I was standing, mouth open while I was recording this fight. I was like, oh my god. The arena really does, it reminds me of heavily, this boss reminds me of Elden Ring more so than anything else. But the boss design is so unique. It doesn't really remind me of Elden Ring. It definitely still fits the whole Nitiba, you know, it fits Stellar Blade very well. But oh my god. And you're still kind of reminded that it is still Adam. He still does the, you know, the pain grunts. So you can't exactly disassociate from, you know, the Elder Nitiba not being Adam. And obviously I am counting this as one fight. It's just, it doesn't feel right if they're not together. You know, that you know, makes sense. But man, his moves are really cool. I was a little bit worried about him having 3 spears, but I think they're used pretty well. And unlike, you know, the Black Nitiba, which, you know, had a lot lower, this boss's, you know, his insta-death or whatever, he just summons little cherubs, which are just mind-blowing, and they shoot little arrows, but they're easy to shoot. They pop in 1 or 2 hits, and it's pretty easy to kill all of them before he does his insta-kill, which, in my opinion, that's how it should be done. That's how it should be done. Like, as you can see in the background gameplay, they're little cherubs that they shoot, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. Just, man, I was absolutely blown away. It was unexpected. It was unexpected. And, man, he's the only boss, in my opinion, that you could argue topping my number 1. He's the only boss, in my opinion, you can argue that can top my number 1. And I will say, for Taki, I do want to point out, her music's not bad. It's the fact that it's played every single time you go into Taki mode, and it gets annoying, especially in bosses where the music is actually good. That's why I sort of refuse to use Taki mode, because it just overrides the music, and I don't like it. That's something that I really I genuinely hated about Taki mode, is the fact that it overrode boss music, so I refused to use it. But man, in this move right here, you can see in the background, just the angelic, just, oh, it eats almost everything. Again, my only problem is the difficulty. You need to fight this boss on normal or hard, and I made the absolute booty cheeks mistake of fighting him on story mode. I should have fought him in normal mode. When I beat this game on normal, I fought Providence. Also, what is docked from this is the fact that, well, it's out of the 3 endings, you can only fight this boss in one of them. You can only fight this boss in one of them, and you only have a chance of fighting him in one of them. And the game doesn't necessarily lead you to necessarily choose this boss, but I don't like how Providence is 2 out of the 3 options for, well, 2 out of the 3 endings. I would have rather Adam have been 2 out of the 3 options. It's basically if the Moon Presence was an actual good boss, then, you know, it'd be great, but, you know, Moon Presence precedes Garrett of all people. But, I mean, and Adam precedes, well, he comes after Raven, which is why, like, my expectations dropped so low after the Raven fight, especially since we just finished up with my personal, well, with some of my top bosses, and Raven was a disappointment, Providence was a disappointment, but Adam and the Elden Nitiba just being so good was absolutely mind-boggling. It's not up here high enough, though. It's not number 1 for one reason, for the most part, and that's difficulty and the fact that he only appears like one out of the one out of the three endings. And if you are playing this game for the first time, like I have this, and even if you're doing a replay playthroughs, go for this ending. You have to get Lily up to her progress bar up to 100%, go through Eidos 9, and reject Adam's offer. That is the only way to get this ending. Anything else, you'll be getting Providence as your boss, and this is the final boss. This is the final boss. I'm so happy that they absolutely hit it out of the park with this boss. Just, oh my god. But on that note, this boss is definitely my number 2. And for my number 1 spot, you will be seeing my playthrough, my fight with him. And yeah, we'll be seeing it just absolutely like no commentary, no nothing. And just note that I did have the Japanese, well not Japanese, the Korean voice for this. I preferred it for most boss scenes. But on that note, it is time for, in my opinion, the best boss in Stellar Blade.
Adam, I'm sorry.
Eve. With this, the history of humans is over. Your will, your actions, your decisions. I just hope that everyone is guided in the right direction.
Adam. Goodbye. 여기인가?
맞아요. 그런데 강력한 전자기장이 이곳을 둘러싸고 있어요. 마치 태풍의 눈 속에 있는 것처럼. 저기요! 세상에...
대체 너희들은 자신에게 무슨 짓을 한 거지? 그래, 네 고통만이라도 여기서 끝내줄게.
that was my number one demo crawler. This is, in my opinion, the absolute best boss in Stellar Blade, and it would be tough to challenge it for my number one. Now, as I hinted at earlier with Taki, this boss reminds me heavily of Ludwig. Now, keep in mind, Ludwig's not in my top 3 boss fights. He's just not. That being said, is he in the top 5? Absolutely. In my opinion, the top 3 are Gehrman, Gascoigne, and Lady Maria for the most part. But sometimes Ludwig and Lady Maria switch, but it's kind of rarely that kind of happens, you know? But, man, this fight reminds me of Ludwig a lot, not just because of the bluish-green glowing sword that he has, but also how the music is as well. I noticed he has some moves that are a little bit similar. So, man. And also, it kind of reminds me a little bit of, you know, how Ludwig kind of fought very beast-like. You know, he was considered to be a beast. And the Demo Crawler fights with his hand for the most part, until, you know, you get to a certain point and he just whips out the sword out from himself. We're not going to talk about where he pulls that sword from. But, man, this fight is number one for a few reasons. One is the music. The music is definitely top 3. Definitely top 3 songs in Stellar Blade in general. And this boss, especially on my first time playing through it, I was absolutely stunned and shocked at the boss's design, because it is so cool and it is unlike anything else in Stellar Blade. It is just completely different than any other boss. And this was after Karakuri too. So Karakuri I thought was solid, had the Japanese, you know, aesthetic, and then this boss is just dark, black, and I was like, oh my, with the blue halo ring, I was like, oh my god, what is happening? It was such a 180, and it was just, it's, in my opinion, one of the best juxtapositions of bosses. They're sort of opposite from each other, but like, man, they fit their areas. Now that being said, the arena isn't super impressive, but everything else is just wow. It's just absolutely phenomenal. I can't express how much I absolutely love this boss. His projectiles aren't necessarily annoying. He has an attack, that pulse attack, you're intended to jump over, which is, you know, again, another props that I gave to Karakuri was the fact that you're incentivized to jump over that attack, over one of her attacks, not dodge through it, and for him, it's the same deal. And man, you have to fight this boss on normal. You just have to. It's so good. It was. At the point in time I was at with my first playthrough of Stellar Blade, there hadn't been very many bosses that I was actually sad that ended, but this fight, I was actually sad that it ended. There were only 2 bosses really in the entire game that I was legitimately sad and wanted to just give it another go. And those are that's Adam, the Elder Nitiba, and the Demo Crawler. Those are the only 2 bosses that I legitimately was like, God damn, I wish I could have fought him again. It is rare for me to feel like this about the bosses. Even in Bloodborne's case, really the only boss that I really want to fight again and again is really Gehrman. Gehrman's kind of the only one that I would play boss rush mode just to get to him specifically. Because just, man, the music is just yes! Man, the spectacle, in my opinion, the only boss that comes close in terms of the absolute spectacle and grandiose nature of the fight is, you know, the Elder Nitiba. That face specifically is the only fight that comes close in terms of how grand it is and how, like, sort of cinematic it is in a way. Man, and I can't even talk that much about the music. a weird choice is that the opera portion is in English. That is something that's a little bit strange. In case you don't know, most operas are in either Italian or French. Very, very rarely are they in any other language. Mostly because, at least from what I've heard, y'all can double check me and let me know in the comments if I'm wrong, but I believe it's easier to hold over like opera notes in Italian and French than it is in like, especially like English. No one really does opera in English because there's a lot of, it doesn't fit well with an opera voice. However, you know, in this game, the opera's in English. And I just want to point out one of the lyrics was Dance of Death, Dance with Death. And that's kind of how this track is. It's very Bloodborne-esque in a lot of ways as well. And man, I can't gush enough about this boss. But that is my number one. Let me know what y'all think in the comments below. What do y'all disagree with in this list? I thank y'all immensely for watching to the end of the video. I put a lot of work into this. Yeah, just let me know if y'all disagree with anything in the video. What do y'all think my hottest take is? What do y'all think my hottest take is? I would not be surprised if y'all think Democrawler should be lower on the list than he is, but I just love this boss too much. And thanks for watching. I really do appreciate y'all for watching until the end of the video if you have. And even if you know you just watch the end section, I really appreciate y'all. And the next video next week will be Outbreak Perfected, then Final Shape after that. And I will catch y'all on the flip side.